Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Vicki Janowski, editor of the Greater Wilmington Business Journal, and welcome to this week's WilmingtonBiz Talk. Today, we're talking about the supply chain, and namely what's going on with the disruptions in it and how that might affect our local economy and our local shopping this year. Joining us today is going to be Dr. Drew Rosen, who is a supply chain management professor at UNCW, and also Dr. Rebecca Scott, who's a business analytics assistant professor at UNCW. Before we jump into our conversation, we're going to hear a quick word from our sponsors, Cape Fear Realtors.
Support this program's efforts to connect our community in meaningful dialogue with actionable insights. Realtors are dedicated professionals who build strong, resilient communities and businesses. Work with someone you can trust. Work with a realtor. Learn more at capefear.realtor.
Hey everybody, this is Vicki Janowski with the Greater Wilmington Business Journal. Today we're talking about the supply chain, and it's something that I feel like keeps coming up more and more in discussions as people talk about having difficulties getting everything from paint to furniture, cars, and now even starting to see some stories about a possible shortage of turkeys going into Thanksgiving next week. Makes you miss the good old days when we were just talking about toilet paper and hand sanitizer shortages. So today we wanted to invite a couple experts on from UNCW to give us some insight, explain what is going on and when do we think that the supplies might loosen up again. Joining us today, Dr. Drew Rosen. He is the Duke Energy and Gordon Hilbert Distinguished Professor of Supply Chain Management at UNCW's Congdon School of Supply Chain, Business Analytics, and Information Systems. And joining us after that in a few more minutes, she's just coming back from teaching a class, is Dr. Rebecca Scott, who's an assistant professor of Information Systems and Operations Management, also over at UNCW. So we reached out to the experts we thought could give some insight on it. So we're going to start there. Dr. Rosen, can you kind of give us a broad level view of what's going on, what's behind all these disruptions that we're seeing? Oh, and Dr. Scott's with you as well. So yeah, if you guys could start us both off and just give us a primer of what's behind all these random shortages that we're seeing in the marketplace.
Well, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to talk about something that we discuss every day in the hallways as well as our research. But as Dr. Scott and I talk about often, this is just a perfect storm. Everything that could go wrong has gone wrong. But as you know, there are at times over 100 ships anchored off the coast of LA, waiting to be unloaded. All the goods that we want for Christmas are in those containers. A recent interview with the CEO of the Los Angeles ports basically said, it's going to turn from a product shortage to lawsuits and insurance liabilities, because a lot of those turkeys and a lot of perishable goods that are in refrigerated containers have run out of fuel. So they're obsolete materials, etc. We just can't get the material we need. The biggest problem overarching all of this is we are demanding and buying more than we ever had. And you can put it, and you can look at the inflation, you can look at stimulus checks, etc. But I mean, I've got a chart that shows that is accurate through October that shows that our demand for products has skyrocketed. And the supply chains that we have used in the past are broken. And I'll just say this real quickly, that in the past, manufacturers scoured the world for the cheapest labor. Where could they get the products built the cheapest? And they would hopscotch around the world looking for where they could source their materials. They used a just-in-time philosophy. Just-in-time is very efficient. They could reduce their costs by lowering inventories, but we have a big problem now. You lower inventories, you hopscotch around the world looking for cheaper manufacturing, and you get supply disruptions, i.e. risk. You don't have inventories to offset it, and it brings us to where we are today. Dr. Scott will agree, we talk about it a lot, it is a perfect storm. So, I mean, that's in a nutshell.
And I do want to get back to that, what you guys see or think for the future, or whether this will, what kind of changes this might prompt in those inventory practices. But again, just to give us, I guess, some context of how we got here, because this is not a situation that is just starting right now, or obviously holiday demand is feeding into it. But this is really something we've been seeing over the past year and a half, really build up to this. So Dr. Scott, can you address a little bit how much of this was fueled by the impacts of the pandemic on top of the issues that Dr. Rosen was talking about, or is that just something that exacerbated something that was already happening?
Well, it's actually kind of a combination of both. On one side, while we have our wonderful technology, everybody truly enjoys ordering things online, having it delivered to your house instead of going to pick it up at the store. And that's been going on for well over a decade of just how life in general has changed on how people have their buying practices. In that case, we had an increase on the entire supply chain, especially on transportation, to get those goods to the individual consumers. So that was, you can say that was the beginning of it. That was definitely where you started seeing the influence or impact on the supply chain and just transportation aspects, just distribution. When we were hit with the pandemic and we, of course, could not go into stores, just like Dr. Rosen had mentioned, we started ordering more online because people still needed their goods. They needed to get food. If their local grocery store might have been either shut down or they could not get the goods, like we always talk about the shortage of toilet paper, then a lot of people, of course, were ordering items online. And in that case, it goes back to impacting the transportation system in getting them from point A to point B. Now, that's just looking at the end. Further up the supply chain, kind of going up to the warehouses, the distribution centers, the actual suppliers, it does the ripple effect. I mean, we call it the bullwhip effect of going back and just causing what started off small, but the further back you go, the impact is much greater because it takes a longer amount of time to get from the supplier to the first warehouse, from the first warehouse to the second warehouse, and then, of course, just spreading it out to all the retailers. So with the impact of COVID, the different stipulations that were put on, whether it was the individual companies, the transportation facilities, the warehouses, and then of course, ultimately to the end consumers, not being able to, of course, we look at it going into stores. Can we go into the store? Can we not go into the store? How many people can go into the store? And because the stores themselves could not get the material, then they were limiting how much people could buy. So it's been an ongoing effect. The COVID pandemic truly blew it up to where most people were now feeling it on our end, on the individual consumer end. But prior to that, it was an impact further up the supply chain with trying to increase the number of truck drivers. Improving our rail system so we could use the rail system to transport the goods instead of using trucks. Trying to improve our ports because more goods were being purchased. So it's been an ongoing situation, but like I said, with the pandemic, it really brought it to the eyes of the individual consumers quite a bit.
And Vicki, I'll just add to that, you asked the question, what brought us to where we are today? And pure and simple, it was poor planning. The supply and demand forecast when the pandemic hit, that's past history. How long ago was that? A year and a half ago. The manufacturers thought demand would fall. They banked on it wrong. Demand went up. So they canceled orders. They idled some factories, etc. It was the exact opposite. They didn't understand the psychological nature of you and I, that we were cooped up, we wanted to buy more. Well, all of a sudden they slowed production. They didn't forecast that demand would increase. That right there from the beginning puts us where we are today, is that we're behind the 8 ball only because they guessed wrong. Sales and operations planning, sales planned it and operations shut down.
So then going off of that then, so what do you and other experts see in terms of going forward? Is this show any signs of loosening in the near future? Is this going to be around as a long-term issue, since a lot of things that you're discussing, with infrastructure and just the supply chain in general and how goods move through? I mean, these are very large, complicated processes that take time to untangle. How long, I'm going to boil it down to a nutshell, how long before we can get like a new car or get new furniture to come in? But no, really, what are people saying in terms of when the market will loosen up?
Unfortunately, a lot of when we're going to start getting additional items, I mean, we're looking at months out. The majority of, well, almost all of our items that come internationally come by boat. And of course, you can just look at Long Beach, and I mean, that's just one example. And you can look at the other ports as well. It's one of those situations that there's a lot of moving parts. So just unloading those ships is not going to fix the problem. We have a truck driver shortage. We have a port operation shortage. We just have a shortage of people working in logistics and distribution, in transportation, in the supply chain, across the board. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why, but pushing past the why and trying to bring those people back or anybody to fill in those spots, then you also have a learning curve, because the last thing you want to do is put someone working in a port or working in a warehouse that has never been trained, and having somebody wait an extra week for their material is a lot better than, of course, having any type of accident occur. So unfortunately, we're looking at months down the road just to see major improvement. We'll start seeing like trickles because especially as the holidays are coming up, we always have people who volunteer to do those holiday hours. You see it a lot with a lot of the trucking companies at UPS and FedEx. They're always hiring their, can call it the holiday support, but it still does not completely erase the shortage of drivers to begin with, just looking at those two specific companies.
Vicki, the last numbers from the ATA, the American Trucking Association, says we are short 80,000 drivers, okay? 80,000 drivers. And you asked the question, everybody asked the question, when are we going to see some release of this congestion? I hate to say it, but I'm going to say we're not going to see any reduction or release fourth quarter 2022. It's going to take a while to break this log jam, because as Rebecca said, it's not just the port. They first got to get to the port, but where are they going to put these containers? The inland ports are overloaded as well. The containers have to be stored somewhere. Those containers being stored somewhere, they need to be emptied, then they need to be shipped back. You know, the Oval Office said we're going to work hard to get more containers. It's not just containers, it's drivers, it's chassis. Right now, a lot of those chassis are sitting holding containers. So it's all different aspects. But I'm gonna bank on fourth quarter 2022 at the earliest. It's going to be a bleak Christmas. As everybody says, shop early. There will be everything you want, but it won't be in the supply and the variety that we are used to.
And let's talk about a little bit more about the ports and just our local facilities. So now that we've talked a little bit about the national trends that we're seeing even here, where do you see that impacting some of the local users, like the Port of Wilmington, like some of our bigger logistics companies? How do you see them being impacted?
Well, actually, the Port of Wilmington has excess capacity. We don't get the volume that the Port of Charleston, Savannah, Miami would get, but we have excess capacity. I'm going to liken this back to when the Evergreen got stuck in the Suez Canal. Shippers were looking, they were having to make real-time decisions. Do we sit there and queue up and hope the canal is going to open back up to go through it, or do we reroute ourselves through the Strait of Hormuz? And I'm looking at Dr. Scott, because she was stationed there all last year. But the cost to reroute one of those container ships around the Cape of Africa and back up to East Coast ports could be hundreds of thousands to $1 million. But that's real-time decisions. I'm hoping that these, a lot of manufacturers, now that they see the risk involved in the supply chain disruption, that we are going to start reshoring or nearshoring our manufacturing capabilities. Reshoring, bringing it back to the US, nearshoring, i.e. either Mexico, Canada, or Eastern Europe, that we don't have to rely on going from China. Vietnam is a huge other market where things come from. So if we start to nearshore and bring it back closer, then I believe the East Coast ports are going to reap the benefit of it, because the materials, I mean, we have a good flow of materials. You know, the Port of Wilmington is not the size, again, of Charleston, Savannah, et cetera, but we have excess capacity. And that positions us in a great place, I think.
So kind of piggybacking off of what Drew said, so while we do have the port capabilities, this is where getting the material to come here leads into the bigger issues. So are we as in Wilmington capable of bringing in the material? Absolutely. We have the airport, we have plenty of rail lines, we have, of course, I-40 and plenty of other roads coming in, and absolutely the port. But we don't have the warehouses. Well, let me rephrase that. The warehouses do not have the material to necessarily ship directly to us, because of course the warehouses have to feed several other communities as well. So we're good on our side as far as accepting, but it's the supply chain how it's just kind of broken all the way back and trying to get the material to us. Now, of course, one advantage we do have is because we are on a port and we have the rail lines and an airport in town, we do have multiple abilities to feed in the material. So the incoming material, they have plenty of options on how to bring it to us. So in that case, we actually have a better chance of seeing more material coming in, especially right after Thanksgiving, as they're emptying some of those ships down in Charleston and Savannah, and they can start feeding it up our way. And then of course the individual businesses can continue to purchase or request the material from the warehouses and distribution centers. So we are in a much better advantage compared to some more isolated areas. But unfortunately, it's just a matter of that material getting to those warehouses prior to coming to us. And that's one thing, unfortunately, we do not have control over.
Okay, and let's take a moment to look forward. Dr. Rosa, you mentioned, part of the issue feeding into this has been our history of reliance on just-in-time inventorying and some of those practices. So what do you see in terms of, does this have the potential to change some of those global supply chain practices we do, whether it be with inventory, transport, like you mentioned a couple times, or even labor practices? Just in y'all's opinion, what do you think could be things that are done differently in the future to prevent this?
Well, before I talk about what can be done differently, you just brought up a good point, is labor practices. Next year, within 12 months, longshoremen's contracts are going to be renewed. And we don't know what's going to happen with that. But as I said, I'm still looking at fourth quarter 2022, this log jam to break. If we have any problems in contract negotiations with the longshoremen, it's just gonna impact it. We're all gonna go back. We're gonna go back down. Prices are high, and I think manufacturers are finally. I was on a conference call yesterday about, have we ignored risk in our supply chains because everything was working so smoothly, and we were not looking at the risk the pandemic is a good example, but there are other risks. If you look at the gas prices right now, or if you look at the hurricanes that hit through Louisiana and Texas in the last year, shutdowns in China because of rolling blackouts, they don't have enough power. We got to start looking at risk, and then adding in the risk factor to what we are doing. And that's manufacturers will change. They realize that they've been too complacent on what worked in the past. Rebecca and I argue a lot. We both have, which is great because that's how you get research done. But what's going to happen in the future is they're going to have to start adding a risk component to this and start figuring out a better way to do it. Just in time is broken. Supply chain models of 10 to 15 years ago they're broken. We can't keep using them.
Well, we moved past them.
Yes.
And Dr. Scott, what are your parting thoughts then, if looking forward on solutions?
Actually, a lot of it is in agreement, believe it or not, with Dr. Rosen, even though we do argue about the best next steps to do. So just like he said, I mean, we as in the supply chain realm, I mean, we did get comfy cozy. We've had a really good run with a lot of things. And just like in anybody else's life, you tend to put some of the risks aside, or you think it's not going to happen to me. And just like technology keeps evolving and information keeps changing and new software comes out. And of course, now we were just we're continuing to be faced with this pandemic. And of course, Mother Nature can always be a beast. It's time to really look at all these various risks and just what we can do to kind of go past them in a much better manner. So it's a very good learning point. Unfortunately, we had to get to this point to learn it, but it is a very good learning point for everyone involved in supply chain. It just, unfortunately, change takes time. And while we'd like to just, flip a switch and have it all fixed by tomorrow, first we have to get out of our current situation and make changes as we can, because a lot of things are locked down with contract. And so we're going to have to, of course, make sure we keep true to our contract and also try to make changes in the future in hopes that there will be, of course, the right changes and figure out what level of risk we're willing to accept in order to just make it much better for everyone involved, supplier all the way to consumer. And
I think Wilmington's going to end up being a winner in all of this. As manufacturers start to look at the risks involved, that they will start bringing in smaller ships from the nearshoring, which will be able to come into our port, that they were putting on larger ships going to the port of LA. What we talked before we came live is that locally Megacorp Logistics, they're positioned here. They're a fixed asset-based company. They've got the trucks, which helps us, even though they are national, but they're local, so they can help us. I think the picture for Wilmington is extremely positive as we go forward, as these manufacturers start analyzing the risk and saying, you know what, the Port of Wilmington, the Port of Charleston, the Port of Savannah holds less risk for us. Let's start using them.
All right, thank you both for coming on this afternoon and just sharing that insight and background on this topic, which obviously is impacting businesses and consumers in our area in just myriad ways. It's not the final look that we'll be doing on this on the Business Journal. We've got the upcoming Power Breakfast, our last one of the year, on December 14th. One of the speakers will be Brian Clark from the North Carolina ports, and he'll be talking a little bit more about the impacts on this issue as well. Our next edition of the Business Journal, coming out December 3rd, will be a cover story, taking even a deeper dive on this and its impacts on the local economy and local businesses. So we'll have much more coverage on that as well, of course, always as we turn our discussions here into our podcasts, which you can find on your favorite podcast streaming platform. And you can catch up on previous talks on our WilmingtonBizTalk.com address. But thank you to you both for coming on and spending your lunch hour with us. And we will see everyone else here next week. Thanks.
Thanks, Vicki.
thank you.